As the noted existentialist philosopher Michael Scott once said, "It takes a big man to admit when he's wrong, and I am that big man." And so we open tonight with a brief mea culpa. For when I proclaimed after watching one episode that House of the Dragon is a woke show, or eine Wochenschau, as the Germans call it, I made the wrong call. I'm pleased to report that it's not a woke show. It's actually a pretty good show. Certainly the best thing that's come out of the Game of Thrones universe since they ran out of source material to adapt after season 5 of the original show and had to start writing it themselves. We all know how that turned out. She's McQueen, I don't want it. She's McQueen, I don't want it. She's McQueen, I don't want it. And so on. But when I proclaimed, prematurely, as it turns out, that House of the Dragon is a woke show, I did it mostly based on two things that I thought I saw. I thought I saw another in the long and interminable line of Mary Sue girl boss protagonists who are the bestest ever at everything and can easily dispatch half a dozen full-grown male assassins without getting a hair out of place. And I also thought I saw the race swapping of a few characters that was done just for the sake of a good bit of race swapping. But this race swap, and this has got to be a first in the era of woke Hollywood, it actually serves a pretty interesting narrative function, because the central plot device in the story is the disputed paternity of Princess Rhaenyra's 3 sons, the eldest of which is second in line to the Iron Throne, who are supposed to be the offspring of her secretly gay husband Laenor Velaryon, but in reality they were fathered by one of the knights on the King's Guard that she's been boffing for upwards of 10 years now. In the books, the Velaryon family, they look just like the Targaryens do. Blonde hair, blue eyes, milky alabaster skin, that whole thing. So in that setting, the only thing that can give away the bastardy of these kids is maybe that they don't have the signature Targaryen super-duper blonde hair, but the way they've done it in the show, those kids should be quarter black, and they very clearly are not. So it just underscores the extent to which everybody is like, oh, come on, are you buying this? Because we're not buying this. We know what quarter black is supposed to look like, and that ain't it. And the poor king, I feel so bad for the king. He is King Rodney the First. He just wants everybody to get along. He just wants to be in denial about the whole thing until he can die in peace. And the self-delusion is strong with this one. His wife, the queen, she reaches the point of exasperation and pleads with him to open his damn eyes and see what's right in front of his face. And he very calmly sits down and says, "Look, honey, one time when I was a boy, I had a white horse. It got knocked up by a gray horse. And what should come out but a brown baby horse? Wouldn't it be fun if it worked that way with people, too? Like some Mormon couple in Utah go in to have their 5th kid, and like a little baby Eddie Murphy randomly pops out. A lady in Samoa gives birth to a bouncing baby Eskimo. An Orthodox Jewish couple welcomes their brand new Chinese daughter. But I did make one mistake. After last week's episode of Hot D, as all the fashionable YouTubers are calling it, I went and listened to an episode of the official podcast, because I like those official podcasts. The ones from the HBO shows tend to be particularly well done, but this one, Jesus H. Christ, it was just wokesters speaking wokesterese. I could not believe that the people to whom I was listening, it was the showrunner and the lead writer, something like that, I think, could have delivered a pretty solid show that I was about to proclaim non-woke, because it sounded so over the top. It sounded like a goddamn parody of wokesterism. This guy's saying some shit like, well, it was important to us to figure out how to navigate the patriarchy. And when we started out on this show, we started from a place of how are we going to use this to make the world a better place? It was so freaking nauseating, I had to turn it off and try to forget that I had ever heard it in the first place. But, you know, I bet I could speak flawless wokesterese if I had to. I bet you could drop me in a TV interview chair right now, introduce me as some sort of woke community activist, and I could wing it so good nobody would ever know the difference. You know, this is really about raising awareness of the disproportionate impacts that systems of privilege have upon historically marginalized communities, and particularly communities of color. See, you just spew nonsense like that for a few minutes, and then Bob's your uncle. But Laenor Velaryon is definitely not your dad. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where the black bar of bastardy isn't just a heraldic device, it's also the name of our local watering hole, Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant who freaking loves doing videos about NASA history. And today is a big day for NASA history for a couple of reasons. First, it's the 60th anniversary of the flight of Mercury-Atlas 8, the fifth U.S. manned space flight, which was supposed to be Deke Slayton's flight, but wound up being Wally Schirra's flight. More on that in a moment. And today is also the 87th birthday of one of the greatest living Americans, lunar module pilot of Apollo 16, Brigadier General Charles M. Duke, U.S. Air Force, who, of course, is one of 12 Americans to walk upon the surface of the moon and one of only 4 who remains alive, along with Buzz Aldrin, Dave Scott, and Jack Schmitt. The first thing that needs to be said before getting into any of his very considerable exploits is this. If there is a dictionary entry for the term Southern gentleman, Charlie Duke is the guy whose picture is on the page right next to it. Charlie Duke is the most decent man you could ever hope to meet. Some of his contemporaries, even some of the more famous ones, they were great pilots and heroic astronauts, but just god-awful husbands and fathers. Charlie Duke is one of the exceedingly rare breed of men who was great at both. In fact, you can put the whole crew of Apollo 8 on that list, too. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, Bill Anders, all of them only married once and still happy. And kudos to all of them, because can you even imagine how difficult 1960s NASA marriages were? Even in the best case scenario, it would have been difficult, but even more so when once or twice or 3 times a year, somebody in the program winds up suddenly dead. His wife a widow, his kids orphaned. Everybody knows about the Apollo 1 fire with Grissom and White and Chaffee. Most probably assume those were the only astronaut fatalities during that period, but they weren't, and not by a long shot. 6 other guys who never flew in space, so their names never got famous, perished in various T-38 crashes and parachute mishaps in the period between 65 and 70. And when you're talking about an organization that has only got 60 or 70, 75 guys in it, that is a fatality rate that would make an Iwo Jima Marine shudder. There's a common perception, and it's a thing that even haunts some of the Apollo astronauts themselves. Gene Cernan spoke eloquently and powerfully about it toward the end of his life, that the guys in the Apollo program, nearly all of whom were active duty military, were getting a cushy ride because they got to fly rockets to the moon instead of flying an F-4 over some Vietnamese rice paddy with a couple of MiGs on their tail. But were they really? Because as a practical matter, if you put the Vietnam fighter pilot fatality rate up against the NASA astronaut fatality rate, any man who wants to play the percentages and stay alive would pick fighter pilot over astronaut. And in the embryonic days of human spaceflight, the Mercury days, literally 100% of the astronaut corps was made up of fighter pilots who had seen combat, sometimes lots of combat, in Korea. There's a fun film of Buzz Aldrin when he looks like he's about 8.5 years old. He's being interviewed on the flight deck of the carrier just as he's just returned from a mission. Wally Schirra saw his time in Korea as well, just as all the men of Mercury did. And when it was time to start strapping human beings onto ballistic missiles where the nuclear warheads were supposed to go, he was one of the 7 fortunate men chosen to be the human test subjects. Al Shepard flew first. Everybody knows that. Gus Grissom flew second. Both of those were Mercury Redstone flights, 15-minute little hops from launch pad to splashdown, strictly a matter of, let's see if we can get a man into outer space and get him back alive. And after that, you start getting into the Mercury-Atlas flights, the orbital flights, the first of which was John Glenn, second of which was Scott Carpenter. Now, there were scary moments on both of those flights, like mission-critical type scary. Glenn had to do his re-entry with his retro rocket package still strapped in place because on the ground they were getting a signal, which was an erroneous signal as it turns out, which said the heat shield was loose. And with Carpenter's flight, well, that depends a lot on whom you ask about it. If you asked Carpenter, he would have told you, well, it was an engineering flight. I was supposed to be testing the capabilities of the spacecraft, so that's what I did. And I also wanted to take a bit of time to enjoy the experience of being one of the first men to fly in outer space. And you know, at the end of the day, I got the spacecraft back on the ground safely. But if you ask Chris Kraft, who was the flight director in those days, you would get a rather wildly different answer. Chris Kraft would tell you, Scott Carpenter wasn't doing any goddamn engineering flight. He was daydreaming. He was sightseeing. He was taking pictures of pretty clouds. He was playing games with his maneuvering thrusters, using up all of his goddamn fuel. And then he lands the damn thing 800 miles short of where he's supposed to be. Indeed, Carpenter hadn't even been located yet by the recovery forces. It wound up taking several hours, and Kraft was already telling anybody who would listen in mission control that this son of a bitch is never flying in space again if I have anything to say about it. So you've had 2 orbital flights up to this point, and both of them, in different ways, had flirted with disaster. And those were only 3 orbit missions. Then the next goal on the agenda was to go twice that long, go 6 orbits. So there's a hell of a lot of pressure, technical pressure and political pressure on the guy who's going to be next up, which is supposed to be Deke Slayton. But what's this? Uh-oh. The flight surgeon says Slayton's got a heart dysrhythmia. That dude's grounded. So you're next up, Wally Schirra. And Wally Schirra, even as a pinch hitter, he flies just about as flawless a flight as a pilot can fly. 6 perfect, beautiful orbits. And then he parks the damn thing half a mile from the recovery ship. The only technical glitch on the flight was with the heater circuit on the spacesuit. The spacecraft itself performed flawlessly in all respects. In fact, it was such a great flight that it unintentionally cost Schirra his friendship with Al Shepard. You see, they had 10 flights scheduled for Mercury, which leaves 2 more to go after Schirra's flight, and the only objective they have got remaining is to see if they can leave a man up there all day, which Gordo Cooper is scheduled to attempt on Mercury-Atlas 9. And then after that, Mercury-Atlas 10 is supposed to be Shepard's second flight, but Cooper's flight proceeds nearly as well as Schirra's had done. And the NASA brass decide, you know what, this last flight seems pretty redundant now, so why don't we just drop it and get on with Gemini? And Al Shepard's ego didn't take that very well. He was really attached to the idea of being the first man to fly in space for a second time. And don't forget, he is still very pissed off about not being the very first man to fly in space, period, because NASA decided they needed to fly one more chimp before they tried flying a man. And in the meantime, Yuri Gagarin's flight happens, so Shepard loses by 2 weeks. And he hates that. And he's taking this news about the cancellation of his second flight so badly, he does just about the most absurdly childish thing an American hero has ever done. He calls the freaking White House and asks President John F. Kennedy himself to personally intercede and put his personal vanity flight back on the NASA launch schedule. And Kennedy laughed so hard he nearly dropped his secretary. And since Al Shepard was kind of a psycho, if you hadn't gathered that already, he managed to convince himself that this was all Wally's fault somehow, as if Wally flying a perfect mission was intended as a personal affront to Al, like Wally was thinking, I'll show that bastard Shepard, I'll fly this thing so good they cancel his flight. It'll be great. Schirra flew 2 more times after Mercury, first on Gemini 6A, in which he participated in his history's first outer space rendezvous, and finally as the commander of Apollo 7, the first manned flight of the Apollo program, and the first flight of any kind after the 20-month shutdown owing to the investigation of the Apollo 1 tragedy and the resulting redesign of the command module. Walt Cunningham and Don Isley were the other 2 guys on that flight, and by the second day, they had all come down with head colds, and they were getting a bit cranky from time to time. Mission Control kept wanting to add unscheduled TV broadcasts to the agenda, and much to the consternation of their crew because they were trying to accomplish their mission objectives. So things started getting a bit testy, and then followed something, some refer to it as a mutiny, but that's being a bit melodramatic, I think. The astronauts decided amongst themselves that they were going to leave their helmets off during re-entry so they could squeeze their noses and equalize the pressure in their heads as they were descending, lest they were worried about somebody bursting an eardrum if they had their helmets on and couldn't do that. Well, Deke Slayton, who by now is head of the astronaut office and technically Wally Schirra's boss, he loses his shit when he hears about this. He jumps on the spacecraft radio loop, which never, ever, ever happens. And there follows the testiest public exchange in NASA history. He says, yeah, Wally, this is Deke, and we're going to have a very long conversation about this when you get back. Until then, it's your neck, buddy, and I hope you don't break it. And Schirra replies with just the perfect deadpan, snarkiest you've ever heard, okay, babe. But there was an important precedent and doctrine established by that incident, because Slayton was wrong and Schirra was right. And from that day on, it's been standing policy that it's the spacecraft commander, not the flight director or anybody else on the ground, who has absolute and final decision-making authority on board the spacecraft. So if you ever wondered why Wally Schirra used to do all those cold medicine commercials when you were a kid, well, now you know. Charlie Duke, I don't think he's ever had an unpleasant exchange with anybody, certainly not in public. Now, if you're not a big NASA fan like I am, but you've still seen all the standard things that most people have seen, then you may not know Charlie Duke from Apollo 16, but you do know him from Apollo 11 because he was the guy on the Capcom console when Armstrong and Aldrin were landing on the moon. Roger, Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. That's Charlie Duke. Charlie's crewmates on Apollo 16, which was the only time he ever flew, incidentally, were Commander John Young, history's greatest astronaut. Don't argue the point with me. You will lose. And Command Module pilot Ken Mattingly, who, if you've seen Apollo 13, he was the guy who got exposed to the measles by Charlie Duke, because it's a small world, and grounded 2 days before launch. And so since Jack Swigert was his backup and wound up flying on 13, then Mattingly got slotted into Swigert's former spot on the backup crew, which was the main crew, for number 16. And for Mattingly, I'm sure that was a crushing disappointment at the time, getting grounded 2 days before launch. But man, did he get the better end of that deal in the end. He had to wait a couple more years to fly, but instead of an aborted mission and freezing his ass off for 5 days, he got to actually fly the mission that he had been training for that whole time. He's also the first man ever to do a deep space EVA, because when they were on the way back from the moon, he had to climb outside and retrieve some film canisters from a compartment on the side of the service module. Ken Mattingly, he's also still alive, one of a dwindling number of the men who have flown to the moon but not walked upon it. You've got Mattingly, you've got the aforementioned Borman, Lovell, and Andrews, you've got Tom Stafford, the commander of Apollo 10, and you've got Fred Hayes from 13, and that's it. It will be to our eternal shame as a species if the day should come to pass in the near future when there is nobody alive who has ever traveled beyond low Earth orbit. But for today, Charlie Duke, a grateful nation, renders its salute and wishes you a very, very happy birthday indeed, with many more yet to come. You are an American hero, a bona fide legend, a fine man, and the world continues to prosper for your presence in it. Thanks very much for watching. Be back Wednesday. Have a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.